Okay, and with that, it is my very great pleasure to introduce the final speaker of this morning's session and the third speaker of the day, Brennan Kettelle, a research master student of religious studies at the University of Amsterdam. They hold a master's degree in gender and cultural studies from Simmons University, and their research focuses on the intersections of esotericism and queerness, with a particular interest in sexuality, esoteric orders, and 19th and 20th century occultism. And the title of Brennan's paper is Lesbian Jesus, Mystical Transport and Mythic Transformation in the Poetry of Renée Vivien. Go ahead, Brennan.
Thank you, Manon, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. My paper involves a closer examination of Renée Vivien's poem, The Pillory. Vivien's works are full of mythic reimaginations, subversions, and lesbianic themes. However, The Pillory, in which Vivien imagines herself as Jesus nailed to a cross, could easily be overlooked for Vivien's sexier, more transgressive, occult-themed pieces. Moreover, The Pillory is a unique outlier when juxtaposed to the rest of Vivien's works. First, Vivien presents a rare alignment between herself and a male figure. And second, Vivien deviates from her typical muses, misunderstood and vilified women of myth and history, or demonic characters that she transforms into heroes. Lastly, Vivien effectively queers Christ, aligning him with specific lesbian subjectivities. So born Pauline Mary Tarn to British American parents, Renée Vivien was a prominent poet, self-described pagan, and unapologetic lesbian of Paris's Belle Epoque, posthumously coined Sappho 1900. Before her death in 1909, at the age of 32, Vivien had published 9 volumes of poetry, 2 volumes of prose, and a novel. Yet as prolific as Vivien was during her lifetime, Vivien's works are largely overlooked today. With new material that was released from archives relatively recently, scholarly examinations of her life and works are, in my opinion, still lacking. In 1897, Vivien moved to Paris and began her career as a poet. Paris, of course, at this time was a city whose relaxed atmosphere had attracted many queer and bohemian transplants. That being said, the dominant late 19th and early 20th century conceptualizations of lesbianism heavily influenced both Vivien's identity as well as her poetry. Vivien was acutely aware of and very sensitive to society's contempt, criticism, and hatred of her based on her sexuality. Vivien also viewed society as locked in a constant battle between men and women, with men as the aggressors. So Vivien's approach to dealing with both societal ostracization as well as a patriarchal world was to remain on the offensive. She attacked the masses, men, and heterosexuality consistently within her works. And again, while she was sensitive to her own perceived societal rejection, she was simultaneously openly unashamed of her sexuality, viewing lesbianism as having a deeply spiritual and transformative powers. To Vivien, lesbianism was actually the highest expression of womanhood and presented an opportunity to transcend a cruel and androcentric world. Additionally, Vivien's poetry itself is filled with occult themes. Her interest in magic, moon worship, goddess cults, and the transformative powers of witches, plus a general fascination with mysticism, is all apparent. And her work is perhaps best described as gynocentric, sapphic, anti-establishment, and anti-male. As an individual, Vivien is perhaps best encapsulated in a line in one of her poems, quote, "Everywhere I go, I repeat, I do not belong here." Vivien was of this world, but also misunderstood by this world, and she constantly had one foot within her imagination beyond the veil as a means of escaping this world. Overall, her poetic works simultaneously, one, attacks a society which viewed the lesbian as a monster, a failure, or a figure, an object of male voyeurism, while also, within her poetry, valorizing the lesbian identity. Vivien consistently sought to subvert and undermine masculinist discourses by strategically revisiting and then transforming familiar tales. As such, her muses were often mythic, biblical, or historic women who were demonized, misrepresented, or forgotten by androcentric constructions of history. Interestingly, her heroines were also often untouched by heterosexuality in some way. For instance, in her poem White as Foam, Vivien reworked the myth of Andromeda, portraying the woman as ecstatically, almost orgasmically, waiting to be devoured by the approaching monster. I quote, "A sob of terror and love burst from Andromeda's lips. Her eyes fluttered before they closed, before the exquisite delight expressed in the monster's face. On her lips was the bitter taste of death." When Perseus intervenes and rescues Vivien's Andromeda, she becomes enraged that Perseus did not let her die, saying, "Understand, only the sea monster has known my sob of desire, and death seemed to me less oppressive than your impending and suffocating embrace." As told in the original myth of antiquity, of course, Perseus's prize for saving Andromeda was her hand in marriage, a stipulation she, of course, was never consulted about nor consented to. Vivien's Andromeda, therefore, preferred death to marriage and subjugation, which were one and the same to Renée Vivien. In fact, Vivien often killed off her female characters when they were presented with marriage or heterosexual sex, portraying death as the ultimate salvation and a desirable transcendent alternative to heterosexuality. Vivien also valorized villainous femmes, such as succubae, Lilith, and witches. In her poem Education, Vivien identifies witches as victims of persecution because they are misunderstood and hated based on their abnormal powers and gifts. Clearly then aligning witches with lesbianism, Vivien laments that witches have the right to be born and to exist, and she heralds witches for their triumphs against men. Moreover, Satan was valorized within her poetry as well. In a retelling of the Christian creation myth, Vivien's poem, The Profane Genesis, associates Satan with the creation of art, poetry, women, homosexuality, whereas Vivien then associates God with the creation of men, animals, and violence. In her poem 13, the demons Belial, Moloch, Beelzebub, and Astaroth all violently attack and destroy tenets of heterosexuality, such as pregnancy and marriage. Whereas in other poems, she describes situations with homoerotic nuns, priestesses of Astaroth, women in power engaging in witchcraft, etc. So while embracing the misunderstood or vilified woman and also heralding the demonic, Vivien therefore expressly rejected the Godhead in her works on the basis of her lesbianism. In the same collection as the Pillory, the poem we will discuss shortly, Vivien rebukes God in her poem, So I Will Speak, stating, "If the Lord bowed his forehead over my demise, I would say to him, O Christ, I do not know you. Lord, your strict law was never mine, and I have lived as a simple pagan." In this poem, she also rejects the angelic trumpets on Judgment Day, instead dreaming of sapphic songs of Lesbos. Through such poems, Vivien positions God as an intuitive enemy to women, or perhaps more specifically, lesbian women. In mapping her perceived war between men versus women and heterosexuality versus homosexuality onto the celestial plane as well, Vivien also clearly portrays figures such as Lilith, Satan, and demons as allies and protectors of lesbian women. Therefore, it is notable that Vivien grew an affinity for Christ towards the end of her career. While Vivien was undoubtedly defiant and frustrated with the Catholic Godhead, she found a kindredness within Jesus. Drawn to the rejected outsiders of myth and history, Vivien empathized with Christ's position as an isolated, misunderstood, and persecuted figure. She also identified with his suffering, which she seemed to liken to her own. In the poem The Pillory, Vivien imagines herself as Christ, nailed to a cross while a cruel and enthusiastic crowd taunts and abuses her. Vivien's alignment with Christ in this way is significant. Not only does this poem represent one of the few instances in which she valorizes a male character, but it is arguably the only instance in which she aligns herself with a known mythic male figure. The poem begins, quote, "For a long time I was nailed to the pillory, and women, seeing my suffering, laughed. Then some men took mud in their hands and came to splatter my temples and cheek." It is interesting to note that Vivien imagines both men and women as mocking her, as heterosexual women were not necessarily allies to Vivien, nor was Vivien a feminist, per se. The poem continues, "Tears rose in me, stormy like waves, but my pride made me choke back my sobs." This defiance and resiliency against a society that was so contemptuous towards her was a major part of Vivien's poetic imagination as well as her personal identity. Now, towards the end of the poem, it is apparent that Vivien only identifies with certain aspects of Christ, his alienation and condemnation. She does not valorize or identify with more central aspects of Christ, such as his compassion for the masses or his capacity for forgiveness. The poem later states, quote, "I felt a fiery anger wash over me, and silently I learned to hate them." Both Christ and Vivien represent rejected outsiders, each bearing the burden of their own spiritual truths. Yet unlike Christ, Vivien is not willing to forgive or love those who disdain her. Rather, Vivien matches the hatred of the masses. Ending the poem, Vivien writes, "Their insults stung like nettle whips. When they finally untied me, I left. I went with the wind, and since then, my face is the face of the dead." Again, as death and desire were so intrinsically linked within Vivien's larger personal and poetic imagination, and as Vivien often provided the solace of death to her heroines, she herself as Christ was not spared. Vivien's concept of her own suffering was directly linked to her lesbianism. Within Christ, Vivien witnessed a similar subjectivity. However, Vivien was not attracted to the resurrected and forgiving Christ, but rather it was the brutalized and tormented Christ crucified before a hostile and uncaring world that Vivien identified with, reclaimed, and queered. By writing herself as Christ on a cross in order to express her own lesbianic suffering, Vivien subsequently utilized the figure of Jesus as a means to express the pain of lesbian embodiment. Moreover, Vivien connects Jesus, but specifically his torment and crucifixion, with lesbian subjectivities and lived experience. In this way, Vivien crafts Jesus as a queer icon of dejection and suffering. Although this is not the only poem in which Vivien writes about heterosexual hatreds towards her, or her feelings of social rejection, this is the poem in which Vivien gives an embodied narrative to the lesbian experience of suffering, isolation, and ostracization. Moreover, the figure that she uses to do so is first and foremost male, and secondly, aligned with Catholicism and thus a patriarchal religion. More importantly, while Vivien was not necessarily the first artist within this time period to quote-unquote queer Jesus, as is, for instance, illustrated in pre-Raphaelite painter Edward Burne-Jones's The Merciful Night, both the sketch and the final painting. I'm wondering if she is perhaps the first artist to maybe connect Christ to a specifically lesbian experience. Radcliffe Hall's infamous tragic lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, was published nearly 2 decades after Vivien passed away, which also further highlights how truly radical it was for Vivien to be writing openly not only about the lesbian experience, but also aligning Christ with lesbian embodiment. Overall, the spiritual and the mystical permeates Vivien's works. And moreover, Vivien's desire for spiritual enlightenment and transcendence is witnessed within her constant commitment to the process of transformation. Vivien poetically transformed mythic and historically evil women into heroines. She provided counter-narratives for Satan, Lilith, and demons, transforming them into allies and patron saints of lesbian women. She desired to transform society itself from an androcentric to a gynocentric one. And then finally, drawing from Sapphic tradition, Vivien also aimed to establish a new religion that centered around women and sanctified lesbianism as the highest, most transformative spiritual embodiment and act. However, Vivien was also a sensitive and deeply angry poet and woman living in the late 19th and early 20th century. She therefore, of course, found solace and inspiration in rejected, esoteric, and occult subject matters. Yet she also apparently found a kindred spirit within a revered, mainstream, and even patriarchal religious figure. Born a Protestant, Vivien lived as a pagan and died a Catholic, converting on her deathbed. Some scholars have commented that Vivien's fascination with Catholicism actually occurred during the last year of her life. However, the Pilori was written in 1906, which suggests that her fascination with Catholic mysticism and the darker elements of Christ actually extended before her final year. Lastly, perhaps one of Vivien's most shocking poetic transformations within her whole body of work occurs in the Pillory. By aligning herself with Jesus in this poem, while discursively embodying lesbianic pain and a contempt for society, Vivien transforms the figure of Jesus from one of sacrifice and forgiveness to one of lesbian rage and suffering. Thank you. Should I sit for question? Stand. You get in the camera. You look. Yeah, I'll stand with you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Hybrid.
Do we?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you so much for that. That very interesting paper, Brennan. And let's open the floor for questions. Faith.
Thank you for your talk. So I'm wondering, so it sounds like Vivien, worked to kind of become Christ. I'm wondering if, as many figures have done, if she androgenized Christ or saw him as sexless or always saw him as a man who was suffering, but whether he was ever, whether his wounds were seen as, vulvas and, if she gender bended him a little bit or not. That's fine.
Nice. No, that's a really good question. Is this still on? This thing? Okay. So she actually did do some gender play and gender bending with other mythic characters, such as Satan, for instance, in the Litany of Hate, where she kind of writ a sexual encounter between Satan and Lilith in a way where Lilith could seem more of the top or more in control within that power dynamic. In terms of gender bending Jesus, I would be interested to maybe access and dive into the newly released material that was released from the archives. Perhaps there is existing some gender play with Jesus. However, she did come into contact with Catholic mysticism relatively late in her career, about 3 years before she passed. She's speaking through it now. And so I'm wondering myself, actually, Misha and I were talking about this, if perhaps she had lived a little longer, maybe she would have come in contact with female Catholic mystics, such as St. Catherine of Siena and these really subversive Catholic figures. However, the short answer is I'm not sure, but maybe. Yes.
Mm-hmm. We've got an online question.
Oh, you want?
Yeah. All right, so this question comes from Lily Granger. She wrote, "Very interesting talk, thank you. I wonder if you've considered the link between Vivien and Jeanette Winterson in terms of the retelling and reconsidering of historical narratives and their interpretation of Catholicism and its relationship with lesbianism."
Winterson wrote Written on the Body, is that correct?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That is a really good question, actually. I haven't considered the connection between Renée Vivien and Winterson using these kind of strategies of rewriting myth or using open-ended discursive narratives or pronouns, what have you. Perhaps I'll have to reread Written on the Body and then dive into Vivien. It's a really good point. Thank you.
All right, I think, yeah.
Was I first?
I think so.
Okay.
Hi, thanks, Brennan. It was amazing. Something I was wondering, since I think it's 1 year after she wrote the Pillory that she passed away?
3.
3 years, okay. Well, in the last year of her life, as you said, she converted to Catholicism. Do you think, is it plausible to say that she reconciled with the Godhead as a whole in the meantime? I mean, this is hypothetical. That's a bit of a...
That's a really good question. Personally, my opinion is no. I don't think she reconciled with the Godhead. The circumstances to which she converted to Catholicism on her deathbed are actually quite sapphic. So she had a childhood love who was her childhood female friend who had died when they were a few years before Vivien did, and the loss of this friend that she was secretly in love with kind of destroyed her and sparked a bit of a downward spiral and some morose poetry. And so that could be a reason that she was inspired to convert to Catholicism on her deathbed, because this friend Violet Chiletto did. Also, during the last year to like several months of her life, she had a piano tutor who she reportedly had some kind of feelings for, and this piano teacher was Catholic and kind of trying to guide Vivien to Catholicism. So even still, I don't think that she ever reconciled with the Godhead. I think any interest she had in Catholicism, Christ, mysticism was like purely lesbianic foundationally.
Oh,
Yeah.
amazing. That's poetic.
Right, quick final question.
It's a very simple question. I think, well, was she agnostic?
No, she defined herself as a pagan, which could have partially been because that was kind of an in vogue thing to do amongst the poetry salon goers at the time. But she was very into like goddess cult traditions, moon worship. She loved witches, so and she was a deeply spiritual and mystical person. So maybe agnostic, not atheist, though I would say.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
All right, and with that we will conclude. And another round of applause for Brennan.